One of the big arguments that the new atheists make is this. It's their observation, and of course it's a common observation, we all make it, that we are ethical people, we have moral standards and so on and so forth. And in their crusade against God, they realize there could be a problem for some people, because traditionally, in Western Europe certainly, the baseline for ethics, the guarantor of ethics, if you like, has been God. That's the traditional ethic based on Christianity. And so one possible reaction is to say, if you get rid of God, you knock the bottom out of ethics and you leave people morally at sea, so to speak. No, say the new atheists, you don't need God in order to have a base for ethics. We can supply a base for ethics, basing it in science and so on, or society, or both. Now, what I want to say there, when people phrase the question in its short form, can we be good without God? We need to be very careful what we mean by the question, because of course atheists can be good. From where I sit as a Christian, each human being is a moral being made in the image of God, so that whether they believe in God or not, they have a conscience, they are moral beings, and of course they have the capacity to demonstrate good behavior. So the issue is not, can atheists be good? Indeed, sometimes atheists show better patterns of behavior than religious people, professing religious people. So we leave that aside. What I'm referring to is much more what Dostoevsky in his famous novel, The Brothers Karamazov, referred to. If God does not exist, everything is permissible. It's not talking about the question of whether an atheist can be good or not. Of course they can. It's talking about whether there's a rational basis for ethics if God does not exist. Now, if God does not exist, and some of the contemporary atheists are right, then there's no such thing as absolute morality. Everything ends up being relative, and we're all aware of the postmodern phenomenon. And that's a very interesting thing, because it's very hard to believe from practical experience that everything is relative morally. Some things appear to be absolutely wrong. For example, torturing babies. We have a sense that every sane person will reject that as being absolutely wrong. But the existence of such moral absolutes is highly significant. It was the famous Oxford philosopher J.L. Mackie that pointed out that there's a direct path from absolute morality to God. That it's arguable that if you have absolutes, and we appear to have them, whether we argue against them or not, they appear to exist, then that's a pathway to God. Now, on the other hand, if one is to take the atheist view, the question arises, where are you going to get your base for ethics from? Now, various attempts have been made to get it in the genetic structure of human beings, in social behavior, and so on. Well, this is a very big and important issue, but to cut a very long story short, it seems to me that these attempts to generate ethics bottom up fail for precisely the same reason that attempts to base rationality bottom up instead of top down fail. And oddly enough, and perhaps ironically, it was the Enlightenment philosopher David Hume that pointed the problem. He said you cannot get an ought from an is. And some people say, of course you can. If you want to catch the bus at 5 o'clock, you ought to leave now. The is that the bus is leaving at 5 o'clock, so you deduce an ought from an is. But that's cheating, because the word ought in English and most other languages has at least two meanings. That's the ought of prudence. That is, if you want to catch the bus, you've got to leave now. But there's no moral obligation being forced upon you by the fact that the bus leaves in 5 minutes at 5 o'clock. You might want to stay and listen to the rest of this conversation, for example. So we've got to be very careful that there's not a sleight of hand or a sleight of logic being used here. It's the question of moral obligation. How could a set of circumstances, and generalizing that, how could any configuration of genetics or whatever impose a moral obligation on us? And I would be so bold as to say that a lot of the moral confusion that exists in politics, in law, in medicine and in business arises from that attempt. Every business and every profession will have its mission statement in terms of its ethical code of practice. But I notice that if you ask the question, who said so, what's the basic authority, there aren't any real answers, because having dismissed God as a possibility, they find that there's no other substantive argument that they can bring. And Holmes Rolston, in a recent book, said the pathway from evolution to ethics is fraught with difficulty. Well, it seems to me that's the understatement of the century. Richard Dawkins has, and I find this very interesting, in recent writing come to the conclusion that you can't get from science to ethics. And yet so many of the brightest minds in the world are trying to precisely do that, because they see that it's vastly important to give a base for ethics. I would want to argue that it is actually impossible. Ethics involves top-down causation and cannot be deduced simply from a bottom-up system of arguments.